Joining me now is Richard Higgott, political scientist at the Free University of Brussels and the lead author of the Rhodes Report, a review of world order commissioned by the Dialogue of Civilizations Research Institute in Berlin and presented at the annual Rhodes Forum in October. Richard, thanks for being on the program.
Pleasure.
Your report is about the changing international world order and its future challenges. Let's focus on Europe here. To what extent are the rise of nationalism and populism all across Europe, the opposition to the accretion of power to Brussels, and the Brexit crisis impacting the effectiveness of the European Union as a global player?
What we're seeing at the moment is a lack of leadership in the international order, the world order that's traditionally, in the post-World War II period, been thought of as a liberal order, largely underwritten by the US in a transatlantic partnership with the Europeans. We know that there are 3 or 4 factors that are derailing the contemporary world order. One is clearly the behavior of the United States in the last 2 or 3 years, although I would say here Trump was not the instigator, he's the accelerator. The trend was beginning before him. And secondly, of course, what the European Union in its own strategic vision paper called in 2016, its existential crisis. And the elements of the existential crisis you've identified, particularly Brexit, particularly the rise of the populist nationalist zeitgeist, as I call it, in many European countries, and the big questions that they object to that run counter to much of what Brussels is interested in. So they're not, for example, interested in globalism and economic globalization. They're interested in nationalism. They're not particularly interested in the important institutions, the multilateral institutions, whereas the Commission, the External Action Service, Europe, if you like, as seen through Brussels, is one of the few committed, genuinely committed, multilateral actors in the global order today. There are other elements too, and particularly the rising tension in the relationship with the US and China. But Europe is not a bit player in this. I mean, Europe does have a role to play in this relationship, but at the moment it's not punching its weight, and there are things it would need to do to punch its weight, and we could maybe talk about those later.
Is nationalism and populism here to stay, and how will it change the political landscapes in Europe in the long term?
The populist genie, is not going back in the bottle. That does not mean, however, that some of the things that populists have advocated can't be rolled back or reformed. And the particular one I'm thinking of is the attitude towards international economic relations and open free trade. The big myth that's been propagated successfully by populists is that it's immigration, it's globalization that has led to basically the deindustrialization of various parts of Europe. It's not. It's technology, it's artificial intelligence, it's increased efficiency, it's the creation of global value chains, of which Europe is an integral part.
We've seen that in some European countries, unusual coalitions have been formed to sideline the populists in parliament. Is that a good thing or a bad thing for democracy?
Well, depends on your definition of democracy here, and I'm not being some pathetic political scientist who won't give you a definition. But of course, Viktor Orban refers to Hungary as a democracy, but he refers to it as an illiberal democracy. So I'm assuming that your question is about what we've grown up to understand as liberal democracy, and the implicit sub-question you're asking is how do we defend or how do we preserve liberal democracy? I think the answer to that is twofold. One, liberal Democrats need to go on the offensive, on the verbal offensive. And one of the reasons that they've lost, if you like, the debate over the last few years is because of the dramatic change in the nature of how politics is pursued, particularly the creation of what some people refer to as the atomized nature of politics now, through the rise of social media, digital communication, the fact that individuals can basically have as much influence as parties.
So the populists are feeding a narrative of we the people versus the elitist institutions, especially on the European level. Now, if you were advisor to Ursula von der Leyen, what would you tell her to counteract that narrative?
I would go back to the things I've just said. There's got to be a conversation with these people. You can't shut them out the tent, because that gives them an oxygen. You take, for example, just to take the transatlantic analogy again, the only thing Trump's got going for him nowadays is he can feed on what he argues is the disregard of those comfortable elites for the people. And populists, of course, always talk about the real people, and they talk about the past. I like to describe populism as a philosophy that's back to the future, and they're always thinking backwards in that sense. What the new commission needs to do is, one, recognise that there were some genuine grievances, try to deal with them, engage a conversation on. I know it doesn't sound like much. Engage a conversation on them, not patronise. One of the things that's given the populists oxygen is the dismissal of them, as though you have to be an idiot to be a populist. Now, the world may be full of idiots across the political spectrum, but you know as well as I do that it doesn't help to tell people that in conversation. So it really is as much a matter of tone and approach, in combination with dealing with some serious substantive issues. But I'm not an advisor to the European Commission. I'm just an old retired political scientist.
Well, nevertheless, a great conversation. Thank you so much, Richard Higgott, for coming on the program. Thank you.
Okay.